Hi fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am here with a pretty belated end of 2017 wrap-up. I am covering the books I read in the month of November and the month of December today. November is pretty late, and December is, well, let's just say I was reading one of the books up to the very last minute of 2017. So one of the books that I finished in the month of November was Hunger, A Memoir of My Body by Roxane Gay. This book is a memoir, but it's so much more than that. It's a personal account that tackles the way we as a society look at bodies and treat bodies. It's beautifully written in the most raw and approachable manner. This book is so tender, so heartfelt, so poignant, and heartbreaking and courageous on Roxane Gay's part. The book deals with dark, difficult, and important subjects, both about exploring what it means to be overweight and in coping with sexual assault and trauma. This is one of those books that I feel like everyone should read, male, female, regardless of body shape and size. And the best way I can really explain it is to read Roxane Gay's own words. She says, "Writing this book is the most difficult thing I've ever done. To lay myself vulnerable has not been an easy thing. To face myself and what living in my body has been like has not been an easy thing. But I wrote this book because it felt necessary. In writing this memoir of my body and telling you these truths about my body, I am sharing my truth and mine alone. I understand if that truth is not something you want to hear. The truth makes me uncomfortable too. But I am also saying, here is my heart, what's left of it. Here I am showing you the ferocity of my hunger. Here I am finally freeing myself to be vulnerable and terribly human. Here I am reveling in that freedom. Here, see what I hunger for and what my truth has allowed me to create." My only critique of this book was that at times it became slightly repetitive, but who am I to judge? This is what Roxane Gay needed to write to fully cope and share her experiences, and I, as the reader, was privileged enough to be able to listen. One question I always have when reading memoirs is, who is this for? Is it for the author, the reader? Especially when there's a narrative as personal and raw as this one, I tend to wonder exactly why I am reading it. And sometimes I feel intrusive, as if the words and the story aren't truly meant for outsiders' eyes. But I think in this case the text works well in many ways as a release for the author, but does have something for the reader as well. And not just the reader who struggles with body image and self-esteem, but I would argue any reader, because we all have a relationship with our bodies. Another book I finished in the month of November is Consider the Fork, A History of How We Cook and Eat by B. Wilson. This book is a delightful and refreshing nonfiction romp which explores how technology surrounding food shapes and is in turn shaped by its cultural context. It makes you take another look at the items in your kitchen and appreciate them in new ways. I would classify this as a microhistory, but it's written in a remarkably approachable and readable way. If you like a book full of quippy little facts, then this one is for you. Did you know that medieval butter was heavily salted to improve preservation? It was 10% salt by volume, and people actually had to wash the salt out before eating it. I also learned that the yolk of a cold egg is much more likely to break in the pan than a room temperature egg, and that forks were not widely accepted in Europe until the 18th century. This is just such a fun book, and it has me learning the history of kitchen gadgets in an unobtrusive way. It was a delightful audiobook for me, and I highly recommend it. Another nonfiction book that I read in the month of November was Merlin, The Prophet and His History by Geoffrey Ashe. Now, if you are at all interested in Arthurian legend, Geoffrey Ashe is a renowned author on the subject and an absolute must-read for you. Now, I personally knew little to nothing about Arthurian legend and Merlin before going into this book, and I think that that was a mistake on my part. This book looks at the development of the Arthurian legend over time and possible real-life inspirations for the basis of Merlin. One of my lovely subscribers informed me that an interesting aspect of Arthurian legend is how the historical source for Merlin wouldn't have been alive until at least a century after the historical source for Arthur lived, which is curious since they appear together in the stories nowadays. So what exactly happened over the centuries to link them together? Anyway, Ashe's insights were a little over my head. I had a difficult time discerning when Ashe was paraphrasing the legend as written by others and when he's chiming in with actual historical facts. But if Arthurian legend is a subject that interests you, I highly, highly recommend this book. And if your eyes have been glazing over this whole time I've been talking about Arthurian legend and Merlin, maybe go check out the 2008 TV show Merlin and get back to me. Another book I finished in the month of November was The Moorland Cottage by Elizabeth Gaskell. So while I was reading The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot, some of the people I was buddy reading it with, namely Kate Howe and Katie from Books and Things, were comparing it to The Moorland Cottage by Elizabeth Gaskell. So I figured that I had to read this book as well. The Moorland Cottage is rather short, and I picked it up along with The Mill on the Floss reading, which I will actually discuss next, don't worry. The Moorland Cottage focuses on Maggie Brown, the daughter of a deceased clergyman, who is encouraged to give up her own life and passions and devote herself to her brother Edward. The book gets at questions of how much personal happiness can one forego in the name of duty and devotion to another, and is that any way to live one's life? This is a precursor to, and arguably the template for, George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss, and is said by some, including myself, to be better and more worth your time than reading The Mill on the Floss. Even though it's a short little work, the characters are well developed, and its ending is much more rewarding and well suited to the story, in my opinion, than what The Mill on the Floss does to its ending. So naturally, the next book I have to talk about is The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. I finally finished it in the month of November, and this book centers on the character of Maggie Tulliver of Dorlcote Mill, who worships her brother Tom and is desperate to win the approval of her parents. But her tomboyishness and her fierce intelligence bring her into constant conflict with her family. As she reaches adulthood, the clash between their expectations and her desires is explored, as she finds herself torn between relationships with three different men: her proud and stubborn brother, her dear friend who is also the son of her family's worst enemy, and a charismatic potential suitor. The book tackles themes of sibling relationships, unrequited love, and looks at disfigurement and deformity in interesting ways. Now, there are people who love this book and find it to be one of Eliot's most powerful and moving works. Unfortunately, I am not one of those people, and for another take on this work, I highly recommend checking out Jennifer from Insert Literary Pun Here's channel's review, because it is one of her favorite books. I, on the other hand, found the writing to be dry and dull, and the characters to be unbearable, distant, and infuriating, and the ending to be a disappointment at best. I did, however, find the treatment of Philip, the character with the hunchback, and how he's perceived in society fascinating. In many ways, he functions as a manifestation of his father's sins, and there's a very strong theme of inheritance and expectations based on birth and legacy that runs through this book, both in the characters of Philip and Tom. This is one that has been on my radar for years now, but I have to say, I was disappointed in Eliot with this one. It's only the second Eliot I've read after Middlemarch, which I thought was delightful, by the way, and honestly, this book has me questioning whether I should even bother reading more Eliot at all. Another book I finished in the month of November, actually pretty early on in the month, was Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I thoroughly enjoyed the reading of this book, but I have to say that my reading of Far from the Madding Crowd was informed and tainted by the simultaneous reading of The Mill on the Floss. Unfortunately, when I look back on either book, I associate them together. They both discuss unrequited love in interesting ways, and I even started to think about the main female heroines in contrast to each other. Anyway, Far from the Madding Crowd is about a peculiar and headstrong character named Bathsheba Everdeen, who has come to Weatherbury to take up her position as a farmer on the largest estate in the area. She ends up attracting three very different suitors: a neighboring farm owner named Boldwood, a soldier named Sergeant Troy, and a devoted shepherd named Gabriel Oak. Each, in different ways, interact with Bathsheba, informing her life choices in a tragic story of life and love. The character of Bathsheba, for me, though, is what makes this story worthwhile. Most regard her as an ambitious, independent, headstrong, determined, free-spirited feminist hero. But I think that that's giving Hardy a bit too much credit. In many ways, Bathsheba is independent, and in many other ways, she exists solely to interact with the men in her life. At some points in the novel, she has more in common with the archetype of a manic pixie dream girl than a bona fide feminist heroine. She can be bubbly and shallow in character and frivolous in her actions, and she's frequently defined by her interactions with men. If the men in her life did not exist, what would she be like? And the way in which the ending can be read is also particularly interesting. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, don't worry. But the ending is Bathsheba finally settling, in my opinion. Has her spirit and liveliness been tamed, or is she genuinely happy in the end? I truly appreciate this book for the way it made me think about Bathsheba. And whatever you may think of her, she is definitely a character worth getting acquainted with. So, moving right along to December, one of the books that I finished in the month of December was A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This one is a reread for me. I listened to it on audiobook the night before Christmas Eve with some Christmas punch that my boyfriend's coworker makes every year. It was such a delightful experience. I absolutely adore this classic tale. If you've somehow evaded pop culture references and don't know the premise of this book, it's about the transformation of a miserly man named Ebenezer Scrooge. He's visited by 3 ghosts who make him contemplate the purpose of his life and his interactions with those around him. It's a book to put you in the Christmas spirit for sure, and I thoroughly enjoyed rereading it. Another reread for this month was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I listened to this on audiobook as well when I was driving to and from work, and technically I'm not quite finished with it. But I did want to talk about it in December rather than January. I only have 3 hours left, and as I said, I've read it before, so I know what's going to happen. It's such a cozy read, and it's perfect for this time of year. If you're unfamiliar with the story, it follows the 4 March sisters in the Civil War era New England as they grow up. The characters are just so endearing in this book. You've got the eldest, Meg, Joe the rebel, who's a bit of a tomboy and loves to read and write and is typically everyone's favorite. And then there's shy, angelic Beth and stubborn Amy, who's a bit selfish and more interested in class and status than the rest of the characters. And then there's Marmee, who's a wonderful, generous mother trying to mold her little girls into little women. And the elusive Mr. March, who begins the book at war and I think takes a backseat to the main premise of the book, but he serves as a reminder of the time period and historical context surrounding the book. The book's a bit didactic and moralizing at times, but it's also a classic and something that I feel anyone can get something out of. When I was younger, I wanted to be Jo, and I was massively jealous of the female friendships and camaraderie of the family. I had only one brother growing up, and it seemed like it would be wonderful to be a part of a bigger family of all girls. On rereading this book, I naturally picked up on different themes than I did when I was a child. I used to be bored by the portion about Meg's married life, but now I actually identify with it in some ways. Not always, because her relationship with her husband seems kind of antiquated to me, and I'm also not married, nor do I have any kids. But that feeling of not quite knowing what you're going to do and wanting to turn to your mother for advice is definitely something that I can relate to. And I absolutely hated Beth this time around. I used to like her, or at least tolerate her, but this time she just seemed too angelic and almost lacked a personality for me. And I used to worship Jo. But on this reading, her character flaws were more obvious, and though I still love her to pieces. And I liked Amy's character more than ever on this reading. I think she has the most growth as a character throughout this book. There's just so much to discuss with this one. Jo's love life, Amy's love life, Laurie and his relationships, family dynamics, just so much. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend you read it. So another short story, I guess, that I finished this month was Christmas Storms and Sunshine by Elizabeth Gaskell. Katie from Books and Things suggested that I read this short story since it is so short and it's perfect for this time of year. I actually read it on Christmas Day and it only took about half an hour. It's just such a sweet and heartwarming Christmas short story. It's about 2 families, the Hodgsons and the Jenkinsons, who lead almost parallel lives. Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Jenkins work for competing newspapers, and the families live in the same apartment building. But they simply don't get along. Through the circumstances in the story, they come together for Christmas, realizing that they have more in common than they knew, and it's just so heartwarming and really the perfect Christmas time read. And then, last but not least, I read Wives and Daughters this month. This book is why this video is just coming out now. I finished Wives and Daughters on December 31st. This is definitely one of my new favorite books of all time. I put off reading it for so long because it's an unfinished work of literature, which I have mixed feelings about. Gaskell died before finishing it, but you know how it's going to end, you just don't get the pleasure of watching it unfold. And I also put off this book for so long because it is so long. My copy is 688 pages, but I'm here to tell you that those are not reasons worth putting it off. It is a phenomenal, poignant, beautifully written, and subtle book. It centers on the main character of Molly Gibson and her widowed father, the local doctor. Mr. Gibson decides to remarry to give his daughter a mother figure, and with the new Mrs. Gibson comes a new stepsister, Cynthia. Cynthia is lovable, but is more worldly than Molly and introduces scandal and sensation into Molly's quiet little life. The crown achievement of this book, though, and the reason why it's my new favorite, or one of my new favorites, is because of the beautifully developed and layered characters. They are so brilliant and complex and lifelike. It's not just Cynthia and Molly who are so brilliant. There's Squire Hamley and Osborne Hamley and Roger Hamley and Miss Phoebe and Miss Browning, and I am just so obsessed with this book right now. There's definitely a more in-depth Wives and Daughters video that will be on my channel as soon as I get all my thoughts together, because you can tell I am a little just ranting and raving about this book right now. But I highly, highly recommend that you read it, and yeah, look for that other video soon, because once I get my thoughts together, I will definitely want to talk about it even more. So that is all I read in the months of November and December, which is quite a lot, and this video might be very long. Thank you for getting to the end of it, and I hope the end of your 2017 went well and that you read some good books, and I look forward to seeing you in another video about New Year's reading soon. Bye!